Okay, so tonight's class, we have a very important question. The sixth class, the final class, this has been a, quite a journey through the Talmud, through hundreds of years of Jewish history. So much to learn from. But there's a very fundamental question. Before we begin, what year was the Mishnah composed in, roughly? Remember?
200.
The year 200, very good. What year was the Talmud composed in? The Gemara?
500.
500, correct. About the year 500. Yeah. So here's the question. How many years are we since the year 500? We're 1500 years. What happened in 1500 years? Okay, the Talmud was concluded 1500 years ago. And now, like, since 1500 years ago till today, has anything happened since then? Has there ever been like some monumental, some great, study, some book for the past 1500 years? Like, what's going on? And that's what tonight's class is about. Tonight's class is going to answer a very important question. Yes, you think about 1500 years ago, how many years is America? Right? We're leading up to what? 250. Only 250. You think about it, 1500 years is a tremendous amount of time. Just the whole America is only 250 years. 1500 years ago was like ages ago. And so this is a very important uh, something conversation question to really understand what happened since the Talmud was concluded, which we spoke about in the last three classes, and today. And and uh, and that's for this. I want to give you a little bit of history of that time. Because when the Talmud was concluded, right after that, something insane happened, almost like divine providence happened to the Jewish world. And that is that there was tremendous wars broke out. And Jews started dispersing because until then, the Jews were living in this place called Babylonia, Babel, right? Modern day Iraq. We spoke about the different yeshivas and different sides of Iraq in different areas. But most Jews that are outside Israel were living pretty close to each other in this area. But now, suddenly, after the year 500, Jews dispersed across the whole world. Spain and Portugal, and they went to all these different places. And then later to Germany, the Ashkenaz Jews, you know, and it wasn't like it was before. Because until then, all rabbis were together. You think about it. If you had a question, you brought it when the Jews were living in Israel to the high court. I mean, if you had a question, you brought it to your court. We spoke about this in, if you recall, in lesson 1, 2. If you had a larger question, you went to higher court. If nobody knew the answer, you went to Jerusalem, to the highest court, to the 71 members of the high court in the temple. Once the Jews left Israel, they were still pretty much all together. Rav, Ravir, Shmuel, Rav Abaya, there were different yeshivas, but whatever, it was a few miles. You're able, even from there to Israel, it was 3 weeks travel. And people continuously went back and forth to Israel. It was a regular journey. But once the Jews spread across the whole world, it was over. There's no more the capability, the capacity for hundreds and hundreds of years, pretty much up until recently. And now we have the internet and we have the ability, airplanes and all this to connect people so close. Literally for 1400 years, even more, Jews were disconnected. Somewhat, letters and this, but the real capability, what was impossible. Let's see this. Maimonides, the Rambam, he has a foundational book, which we're going to talk about soon. But his introduction is a highlight. Highly recommend reading the introduction to his book because it gives you a lot of what we studied over the last 5 weeks is written in a concise, beautiful way in this introduction. And this is taken from this introduction. Let's see your text number 1. Sarah, page 212.
Ravina and Rav Ashi and their colleagues constituted the end of the era of the sages who authoritatively transmitted the oral Torah and who set in place ordinances, decrees, and customs that became accepted as normative practice by all the Jewish people. By contrast, any ordinance, decree, or custom instituted by any court that arose after the Talmud in any land, whether it was instituted for the inhabitants of that land or for an entire region, did not become accepted as normative by the entire Jewish people. Therefore, if one of the post-Talmudic scholars thought that in a specific case the judgment ought to be a certain way, and then a later court subsequently determined that the earlier ruling was an inaccurate interpretation of the Talmud, we need not follow the earlier conclusion. We follow whichever ruling is more logically correct and in greater accordance with the Talmud, whether it is authored in an earlier or later generation. All decisions reported in the Babylonian Talmud, however, are obligatory upon the entire Jewish people.
Okay, so what Maimonides here is telling us something very important. He's telling us two things. First of all, once the Talmud was concluded, it's binding. The Talmud wrote the writing, and this is the way everyone has to adopt it. Because, as we said earlier, the fundamental that all the rabbis were together, be able to discuss it. If you remember in lesson 4, at great length, we explained how the Rav Ashi, the one that concluded, he lived 60 years, right? He lived 30 years he was the leader, and he went through the whole Mishnah 2 times, because twice a year, all people would come together and he would study one tractate. The 60 tractates, right? So over 30 years, he went through everything, and everyone was able to discuss, digest, argue, and they're able to come to the final conclusions over everything. So whatever is written in the Talmud, you can't contradict. So that's number one. Number two is that, but the Talmud is written so many years ago. And since then, new questions came up. How do you figure out the answer to these questions? And so for this, there comes what is, we call in Hebrew, a posek. It's on page 214, or poskim. Posek means a rabbi who has authority to render halacha. He could give a verdict. It's a rabbi that didn't just get smicha, but he actually sat and he listened to real life cases. Meaning smicha is like you learn the text and you get tested, you know the answers. But then it's like not always is the text going to give you the actual real life conversations that people really have. So therefore you need to sit by a rabbi or a court with them for years, for a year, 2 years, 3 years. You hear all the questions that come in every single day. And then you get the understanding of really what goes on in people's lives and how to understand and deduce from a law from the Talmud, the law in this case. Okay? So there's many cases in Talmud, but Talmud doesn't always give us every single case that's going to come up in our day-to-day life, right? So therefore, you'll take a case of the Talmud and say, according to this understanding, we can also understand that the law would be in something practical for today. IVF conversations or other conversations, Talmud discusses a woman that's a virgin giving birth. And you take it to today's conversation. There's a lot, as we'll soon see, but there's ideas in the Talmud that are brought, and you could deduce from those ideas for today's conversations. And that's we need a posik. So that's what the Maimonides is telling us, that the rabbis are not restricted from reaching a conclusion that differs from a predecessor of theirs, but not from the Talmud. So they can argue on one of their predecessors, but they can't argue on something written in the Talmud. And this is what the Talmud says. This is the law. This is the law binding. If one of their predecessors says something else, they could come. In practice, there's actually been, throughout the ages, there's been different areas of times. there's 1,500 years. So as we're going to soon see, there was a period called the Gaonim, the brilliant people, that lasted a few hundred years. They came out after the Talmud. They were the leaders of the same yeshivas as the rabbis in the Talmud in Babylonia. And those rabbis were following the Talmud's conclusion. They explained a lot of the Talmud, as we're going to soon see. And after that came what's called the Rishonim, the first leaders after the Godim, after the brilliant people, including the Rishonim. The first Rishon means the first is people like Maimonides, Rambam, or Nachmanides, Ramban, or Rashi, or Tosfos. These are great leading rabbis who lived about 900 years ago, 1,000 years ago. The first one lived about 1,100 years ago. His name was Rabbeinu Gershom, and others. That led for a period of about 500 years. After that, there was a period that the rabbi said, okay, this original period is over, and now it's starting a new period. It's called the Achronim, the latter rabbis. And these are great people, like the Arizal and Rabbi Yosef Karo, the one that authored the Code of Jewish, and the great rabbis, the Shach and the Taz, even the Baal Shem Tov, all these great people that were after. Then that is almost until present today. Some say there's actually today, we call them the Achron, like the later of the later. Why do I say this? Because technically we say that just like a Gemara rabbi can't argue on the Mishnah rabbi, right? If you recall, we spoke about that. The same is true. Nobody can argue on the Talmud, but no, a Rishon, like Maimonides, won't argue on a Go, and an Achron won't argue on the Rishon. So there's still that respect that we give, even since post-Talmud, there's these greater rabbis, and the later rabbis recognize that we're not going to argue with them. Whatever they said is true, we're going to argue on our fellow colleagues. Like there could be Maimonides will argue on Nachmanides, Rashi and Maimonides, right? And then the Baal Shem Tov and those rabbis will argue on Maimonides. You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. Unless they have someone that lived around Maimonides times, what they found that goes according to their opinion, they'll say like, oh, I hold like this rabbi, but they won't argue on the greater body of the consensus of all the adopted opinions. Which the point here is, I'm trying to explain, is that a very important thing, once something is accepted as Jewish law, this is Jewish law. If something is accepted, this is Jewish law, like the Talmud. If accepted, this is Jewish law, this is Jewish law.
Can you give some examples?
What we learned, right? The example of a could you eat before Passover, right?
How about the rabbis arguing with each other? Something was said by Rashi, and now people can't argue later. What did Rashi decide that was contrary or in addition to the Talmud?
So later we're going to bring a few examples. So we'll get to that. We'll bring it out. Okay, you'll see it in just a moment. I want to bring out the concept. The concept is that once everything is accepted, we don't argue. So we don't come and say today, oh, Shabbos doesn't exist, right? No, everyone accepted that Shabbos this is the law. Kosher doesn't exist today. No, Talmud says kosher exists. Nobody can argue with that. Can't be a new rabbi comes and says that today's generation can't handle this thing. We're going to just say it doesn't exist. No, this is what's accepted in the Talmud. Everyone accepts it. And the same is true once this is a accepted law, even from the Achronim, the Rishonim. If everybody accepted this, then this is what's accepted. Nobody can today argue with that. If this is accepted, the thing was that once Jews dispersed across all the lands, that's where you have differences in laws of Ashkenazi and Sephardi, because people didn't really know what was going on in other countries. As let's see in text number 2. Larissa.
Throughout the world, reaching the furthest geographic extremes in the most remote islands. War became more prevalent, and travel was impeded by armed forces. The study of Torah dwindled, and students no longer attended yeshivot in their southern rights as before.
Thank you. So once people dispersed, it was impossible to get the consensus of all the rabbis in the whole Jewish world, like it was from the Talmud. And therefore, there's different laws. And therefore, you have now, if you lived in Germany and the rabbis of Germany decided this is a law for the German Jews, and that was your law, and you had to adopt to that, and you accepted that. And that's where the Ashkenazi followed that laws, primarily like Germany and that. If you lived in the Sephardic areas, so then you accepted the Sephardic laws. And because the rabbis didn't really have the contact between each other. It wasn't like we have today where you're just, traveling all together. So that's why, Sephardic Jews will eat rice. Ashkenazi won't eat rice. They didn't have rice. And so therefore they didn't need it. Over there they had it, and they discussed it, and they said you can eat it. But that was the accepted law. Because they accepted it as the law, so therefore that country accepts it, or those people that are descendants from that country accept it. And therefore that's their law. However, we don't, if we're not, but there's still that concept that if this is your location, this is your law. But if this is not, then you go according to your place, right? And there wasn't that consensus of all rabbis from the whole world together to make that one decision. So this is a very important fundamental to understand. It's similar to the Talmud's conclusion. Nobody can argue in the Talmud. Same happened later. And we never argue in the Talmud, but we'll discuss the Talmud, try to understand the Talmud. And if there's no conversation within the Talmud about this specific law, we'll try to understand through the ways that the Torah teaches us to understand Torah. As if you recall, we discussed that there's 13 principles, the way to deduce ideas from the Torah. So we'll understand it. But the truth is, pretty much any question that comes up today, you could find a basis for the answer for the question in Talmud. Any question that comes up today. There's so many different interesting conversations that is brought in modern day law that they'll say this is discussed, the concept of it at least, in this page of Talmud. And then from this, we have two rabbis, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda, these two great rabbis, Rabbi Huda, Rabbi Huda, right? And let's see who the law would be like and how you could reduce from this conversation to this specific law, right? So now that we understand how Jewish law started, how it all started, let's give the example of the Passover question that we've been discussing until now, right? We asked the question about eating before Pesach. But the question is, what about every Friday? Are you allowed to eat on Friday afternoon, or you have to starve? You have to wait until you eat challah. It's a mitzvah to eat challah. It's a mitzvah to eat Friday night. So maybe you should, right? Or the holidays coming up is Shavuos or Sukkot or Rosh Hashanah, whatever. Every holiday. Do you also have to not eat? So what's the actual law? Right? For the Talmud itself, there was a lot of discussion. It was like a back and a forth and the whole discussion. Right? Here. Okay. So if you look at page 215, and you recall a lot of this that we discussed, we said our Mishnah said specifically the eve of Passover. It doesn't say the eve of doesn't just say the eve of holidays. So maybe it's speaking specifically on Passover. But the problem was that step one we brought that we have a Mishnah, Brisa one, that brought two opinions. One opinion says all holidays and all Shabbats you can't eat. The other one says all holidays and all Shabbats you could eat, which both of them don't go according to our Mishnah. That was our problem. So we wanted to understand who's our Mishnah. So initially we brought step two, Rav Huda's solution, which was that our Mishnah is whose opinion? Who remembers? Rav Yossi. He said, but Rav Yossi, who says you could always eat, says, no, Passover is different. Why is Passover different? Because we're enjoying matzah. Matzah is a special mitzvah. Challah is a mitzvah in the Torah, right? So matzah. So Rav Yossi is the opinion of our Mishnah. Comes Rav Papa. Rav Papa says, no, our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda. The difference is 9 hours or 9.5 hours, right? Then we brought that distinction. Is it close to, or is it at the time of Mincha? Then we said, we have a second brisa, right? That's step number 4. The second brisa proves that Rabbi Yehuda believes that the restriction is always, it's always the same thing. So how can you say there's a distinction? right? So now Rav Papa's answer doesn't really hold. So then we brought Marzita's suggestion. Maybe the second brisa is not better. They made up. It was a mistake. They didn't exactly get the right wording. Close to Mincha or at Mincha's time, and we brought the final thing, which was that he said Pinchas. He said that it was taught in the yeshiva because it was taught in the yeshiva. So therefore, we know that the second brisa is legitimate, and therefore what? Rav Huna opinion, suggestion is legitimate, that our Mishnah is according to who? Rav Yossi. Right? So you have to learn this whole Gemara and remember the whole thing to get to the answer to the law. But you still didn't even know what's the law on a regular Shabbos. Right? And so you have this whole thing back and forth, right? But it's not easy. There are no laws from Talmud. So, and also, how many pages are there in Talmud? Do you remember?
777.
It's double-sided, right? Double-sided. There's like 3,000 double-sided pages, like almost 6,000 pages. How can you get to know all the laws from just reading Talmud? It's monumental. It's hard. It's really hard, right? So imagine, I would say, okay, this is the law book, and I'll give you a set of Talmud. I mean, like, I can't even finish this. And even if I could finish it, I have to find the answers to these questions, right? So let's see now, text number 3. This is again from Maimonides. Okay, text number 3 is it?
Furthermore, it is composed in Aramaic with some other languages thrown in as well. That vernacular was well understood by all the Jews of Babylonia during the era in which the Talmud was composed. In other locations, however, even within Babylonia, during the subsequent era of Hegelian, no one could understand this language without Talmud.
So let me see from Maimonides here. Maimonides is telling something very important. That many people didn't even understand Talmud because Talmud is written in the language that they spoke in Babylonia, which is like a unique Aramaic language. It was, and people then started living in Spain, in Germany. People didn't know, they didn't know what the Talmud was talking about. It wasn't written in Hebrew. There's some Hebrew, but most of it is not Hebrew. So the Gaonim, as I mentioned earlier, the Gaonim were leading rabbis following the conclusion of the Talmud, who were the rabbis that took over the same yeshivas as the Talmud. These are brilliant men. And they were getting questions from Jews across the whole world, asking to explain different parts of Talmud. I don't understand this. What does this paragraph mean? What is it saying here? What is it saying? And they were then writing answers, thousands of answers to questions. And then came other questions, more modern day for their times questions. And they were answering those questions based on ideas for the Talmud. So the Gaonim, here's some examples of some questions in the Gaonim. If you look at page 219, this is a question from, we don't even know who the rabbi is. But the question was, is the custom of reciting Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur appropriate? Today, who does not say Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur? But over there was a question, should we even say Kol Nidre? Is it an appropriate thing to do? Right? So the rabbi answered, we heard that this prayer is recited in other lands. However, it's not our custom in Iraq, in Babylonia to say it. So Iraq didn't say Kol Nidre. Today, Kol Nidre is like Kol Nidre. And they weren't even doing that for hundreds of years. Jewish people weren't doing that. And these were like questions that they were getting, right? Here's another question. When was the Mishnah compiled? And what is Bryce's, why they're not part of the Mishnah? Well, a lot of this is quoted actually in lesson 2 and lesson 3 from this great Gaon, Rabbi Sharir Gaon, who was considered one of the leading Gaonim. We brought in lesson 2 and lesson 3, we quoted his response to this question. Right? What was the Mishnah composed? The Bryces were the additional teachings that Rabbi Yehuda the Prince didn't put in, and there was thousands and thousands of them, right? As we discussed. Here's another one from Rabbi Sharir Gaon. Is astrology authentic? And he said, even if astrology is authentic, It can only determine a particular inclination. However, individuals always maintain the free choice to commit or to refrain from a specific action. Another question from Rabbi Haigon. He's one of the last, the later Gaon. He's the Talmud. We discussed it on Rosh Hashanah. We build a show for 3 sounds: Tekiah, Shevarim, Teruah. When and why did we have to do all 3? Like, when did that all happen? Technically, the Torah says make a sound. We just don't know what's the right sound. So therefore, we make 3 types of sounds. It's supposed to be a sound of a cry. Is a crying sound tekiah, a long sound, or is it like a like, or is it like a little baby? So therefore, we do all 3. But maybe we should just do 1, right? So these are questions that they were getting, and there's so many of them. Actually, on my shelf here, one of the books is just the questions that the Gaonim got. Okay. Now, the Talmud was concluded, and the rabbis started realizing that it's impossible for people to figure this all out. How are they going to know Jewish law? So came a great Rishon, a great rabbi, around the times of Maimonides, in that period. And his name was the Rif. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. He's nicknamed the Rif for Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. Okay? And he lived in the 11th century. He lived in North Africa. He lived in Spain. And what he did was something incredible. He took every section of Talmud, and instead of writing the whole long back and forth and arguments in this, he brought the discussion. We're talking about, let's say, an Eva Passover, what to do, and he said there's 2 opinions, and the law is this opinion. So now, instead of having to learn the whole Talmud and not even knowing what the answer is, you can learn the whole section of Talmud and then turn to the Rif and see basically that whole section that you learned in like 3 lines and 5 lines, and actually know what the law is. Okay, let's see here. Let's see here, text 4a and 4b. Okay, what we're going to see here is that he's going to bring in 4a the Mishnah. He's going to bring the Gemara. He's going to bring the 2 opinions. He's going to tell us what the law is like. Okay, and then we're going to see in text 4b. We're not going to read it, but you just look at text 4b. You could see with text 4b is literally the whole Gemara on this discussion. But you see how he crosses out most of it, and he only puts in what's actually the law. So, but let's read text 4a, and then you could just look at 4b. Okay? So we're yelling, Alan.
One must refrain so close to the time for reciting the Mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. Gemara, we learned in the Baraita one should not eat on the eves of Shabbat or festivals from the time of Mincha and onward, so that one enters Shabbat or the festival has been after. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Conversely, Rabbi Yosef says that one may continue eating until it goes dark. The law follows the view of Rabbi Yosef because there is a rule that the law favors Rabbi Yosef over his scholars. And our Mishnah regarding Passover eating concurs with all views because Rabbi Yosef will concede that eating is prohibited on the eve of Passover due to the obligation to eat matzah.
Okay. So let me see here. We see how. Sorry. Not plug. Okay. What do we see here? That the Rif, he simplifies everything. He goes and he takes all this whole discussion, right? And he says, this is the discussion, this is the law. Let's look at page 223 now, right? Using the Rif's text, answer the following 2 questions. Is a meal permitted on the eve of Passover? And is a meal permitted on the eve of Shabbat and other festivals? What's the answer?
No, yes.
Exactly. Technically, on regular Shabbat, you could have a whole party. You could have a whole party right before Shabbos comes in. You could go, you could eat, you could enjoy, right? And actually, this week we're doing that. It's Purim, and we're going to do our meal right before Shabbos. We're going to lead it into Shabbos. Although this is a caveat, and technically, according to Jewish law, you're not supposed to have a full meal with washing for bread after midday on a Friday, but you could have a meal, but still preferably you shouldn't have a full meal like this. You come to Shabbos, although it's not the law, you could have a full meal for Shabbos, but the custom is not to have a full meal. You could eat, as much as you want. But for Pesach, you should have a full-on meal before Pesach starts. Like this, you'll want to enjoy the matzah. Okay? Huh? Alan says it's always hard to enjoy matzah. Okay. Yes, Alan.
So, the two process. The second one is the one that we said was the active one.
Mhm.
But then, you included the first one and not the second.
No, we didn't say the second one and the first one. For sure, the first one is accurate. We said the only thing was we were asking if the second one is even accurate, because the second one would help us prove that the things like Rabbi Yosef. That's the idea. Of course, the first one is accurate. But right?
The second one is the one that was confirmed, right?
The second, no, the second,
One was the one that-
the first one we knew is confirmed. The second one we also had a question if it's confirmed, and therefore we came in and it's supposed to confirm. Yeah. Okay, but the point here is that the Rif did something great for the Jewish people, and the Rif is published in every single volume of Talmud. You have the pages of Talmud. Right after every tractate finishes, the first thing is Rif. So in the back of every book of Talmud, then we get a book. If you want to move down over just the front. Here, I'll show you here. This is the laws for Pesach, what we've been studying. So this is, and we're going to soon delve into these pages and discuss it. So let's not get lost. But right after, so here's the conclusion of the Talmud. This is where it concluded. Right after it concludes, starts. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's first starts what's called the rush, and then the rim.
This is the Jerusalem Talmud. Right?
This is the no. This is the no. This is the Babylonian Talmud.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this. So here's what it is. Okay. So it's right in the back. The point is, so you see how small the letter is, but in yeshiva, this is what we learn. We learn the Gemara, then you learn this, and then you learn other things, and you could sit and discuss as we're going to see. Okay. But there's a problem with the Rif. There's a big problem with the Rif, and that is, anyone can think of the problem with the Rif? If you just have the Talmud on the Rif, what's the challenge for your average Jew, your average student? In Hebrew. No, he quotes the Gemara, but he's writing in a way we can understand.
Writing in Hebrew.
Yeah, in a way we can understand, yeah. But what's still the problem?
He's not citing the argument.
He's not citing the arguments, he says. But if someone wants to know Jewish law, like what to do, what's the challenge with just having Talmud and Rif?
Still the organization of the Talmud, so you can kind of look up like all the laws that
Very good. So Alan said it very good. So it's still following the way Talmud goes, which the problem is that we cannot tractate Pesach, and if you remember, 3 pages in the middle of this discussion about eating before Pesach, went a whole tangent talking about Kiddush and Havdalah. Because we said about eating before Pesach, and we asked the question if you eat before Shabbos, and then we said Shabbos you have to make Kiddush. How do you make Kiddush? What's a cup and what's Havdalah? Right? If you remember, in lesson 4, we discussed this. Alen. So you want to learn how to make Kiddush, You're going to open up the tractate of Shabbos. You're going to look through the whole tractate of Shabbos, read the whole riff, and you're not even going to know where to make Kiddush, how to make Kiddush, how to make Havdalah. Right? You're going to have to find the laws of Passover in the middle of Passover, find the laws about Kiddush and Havdalah. And like this, there's so many other examples. So you're not going to really know where to find things. So there came Maimonides. Maimonides did something incredible for the Jewish people. Let's see your text number 5.
I, Moses, the son of Naaman of Spain, girded my loins. I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. I examined all these texts and set out to compile the conclusions that can be extracted from all these texts as to what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is ritually impure and what is ritually pure, even some Torah's laws. I will present all the conclusions, clear language, in a concise format, so that the entire oral law will be easily accessible to everyone without questions or objections.
Take my mom and my mom said, I'm going to do something really good for everyone. And he went through the whole Talmud, and also he had the riff and all that. And he said, let me compose a book that will have everything clear, just clear. Clear cut. This is the laws to do in Passover. And just read this book, you'll understand everything what to do in Passover. This is what you got to do when you to pray. This is what you got to do if your animal gores another animal. This is what you got to do if your friend stole your property. This is what you got to do if you want to buy or you want to sell something. This is the way to get married. This is the way to get divorced. And you don't have to read the whole Talmud. Just read these few chapters. You'll know the answer. And he did actually something more than that. All other books, before and after, only discussed relevant conversations. As we remember, we spoke how the Babylonian Talmud only discusses relevant conversations. Because it was outside Israel, they didn't discuss agriculture. Because only in Israel, the laws of agriculture applied, and they didn't discuss any of the laws of the temple because the temple was destroyed. They didn't discuss laws of purity and impurity because that didn't really apply after we didn't have the red heifer. Everybody's anyway impure. So Maimonides says, no, let me teach you all of Judaism. We have 613 commandments. Let me teach you everything. And so his book, in addition to making everything clear, he also gave us everything. The Talmud only gives us relevant laws. The Rif only also gives us the laws that are relevant. But Maimonides, it's a 14-volume book in Hebrew, or 14 sections, and he split everything into 83 different subjects of Judaism, 83 Jewish subjects, and in each subject he could have 10 chapters or 5 chapters or 15 chapters, or for example, Shabbat has 30 chapters because it's quite extensive, right? And with that, he gave you every single idea of Judaism. Laws of kings, laws of mourning, laws of any subject you want, laws of inheritance, anything you want to know, right? If someone passes away and he didn't have any children, the brother needs to marry his wife. We don't do it today, but it's called Yibum. Whole section of that, right? All these laws and everything very, very clear and concise. Maimonides
14 chapters, 14 books. I don't know how concise that is.
Well, there's a lot of laws, but it's quite concise. Actually, we were speaking about it in Shul last week that we just started learning the book again. The Rebbe encouraged that we should study all of Judaism, and the way to learn is to learn Maimonides' laws. You should know the 613 commandments. And so therefore, if you study every day, just 3 of his chapters a day, you finish the whole book, all
What's
14
the
books.
book called?
It's called Rambam.
Just Rambam.
It's nicknamed Rambam, but it's called Mishnah Torah. This is in English. If you look behind this over there, and I have it up there in Hebrew, and there's many prints of this. This Mishnah Torah is one of the most translated and books that are discussed. And actually, in addition to writing this book, he also wrote this in very short. So they can't read the whole book. You could just learn the law, the concise law. So if you learn every day the mitzvah of the day, some days you have 2 mitzvahs, some days you have 4 mitzvahs, then it basically goes according to the split of the 3 chapters a day. Then you'll learn throughout a year all 613 mitzvahs. And you could sign up at Chabad.org. They have a link. You could sign up to the mitzvah of the day, and they send you an email. Every day you just learn the mitzvah of the day, and you know all of the mitzvahs. But if you have time, you can learn 3 chapters a day, which we just started, or you can learn even 1 chapter a day, which many people do. And every 3 years, you'll finish learning all the Torah. And he called this Mishnah Torah. Mishnah means the second to the Torah. The second. Like the word Mishnah. Why Mishnah Torah? Because he says, if you learn this and you learn the 5 books of Moses, you know the whole Torah. You don't need anything else. Now, there are things that is his opinion, and there are other rabbis like Rashi in his times argued with him. They said, you said in a very minute detail, like you said, that trying to think of examples. When you're reading the Shema, you have to, you read it in this way. The other person said, you have to read it, that way. Minute examples in that where they have discussions, which can have different implications in different laws. Yeah, but the point is that Maimonides really made an accessible, organized fashion of knowing all of Judaism. Okay? Everything is from the Talmud. Everything that he wrote is clear. He basically took the whole Talmud, and instead of saying, in the laws of Passover, I'll also tell you about Kiddush and Havdalah, no. I'll make a section for Shabbos. In there, I'll tell you about Kiddush and Havdalah. I'll make a section for Passover, I'll tell you everything about Passover. Let's actually see the way he brought our law in his book of Mishnah. Okay? Text number 6.
Passover from a little before the time for Mincha, and that we arrive at the eating of matzah with an appetite. However, we may eat a small quantity of fruit or vegetable as long as we do not eat enough to feel full. By contrast, on the eves of Shabbat or other festivals, we may continue eating until dawn.
So here, Maimonides tells us the law, concise, clear. But what's interesting is that he also adds another point, which is you could eat fruits and vegetables to starve. Well, that's taken from a later place in the Talmud that we didn't read. It's written about 10 pages later. The Talmud then gets back to the discussion about Pesach, and it says you could eat fruits and vegetables. That's not a meal. Okay. So the point is that Maimonides goes and he can take a whole section of pages of Talmud and 3 lines concise it all for us. And it's brilliant. It's truly, truly brilliant. It's really incredible. When you study the Talmud and then you learn the Rambam on it, it's like, wow, that's amazing. And by the way, one of the most studied books and books that there's commentators on is the Rambam's book. There's hundreds of commentators on Rambam and discussing because there's so much brilliance to it.
And the Rambam lived when and where?
The Rambam lived about 800 years ago, lived in Spain, and he came to Egypt. He was the doctor of the king, the Sultan of Egypt. And then, after he passed away, his body landed in Israel. And he's buried in Tiberias. Yeah, there's a big miracle. Went on a donkey, and the donkey walked to Israel, and it just stopped at a certain plot, and that's where they buried him.
I don't remember what city, but I was touring Spain. They showed like this is where he lived.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a Jewish building.
Yeah. 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 And he was for many hours a day, he was in the Sultan's palace, treating him and taking care of him. And he writes now, he used to come home and his room was filled with patients, Jews and non-Jews. And the whole day he had to care, the whole night he had to care for them, and he had no time to study himself. He writes his history. But with all that, he wrote, this book, which is a monumental book of Judaism, plus more Nevuchim, many other writings from Maimonides. Anyway, so the problem is that even Maimonides himself was is an incredible book. However, he was one of many of the great rabbis. There was Nachmanides, there was other great Rashi and other great rabbis in that time that argued on him. And so we didn't have what is the actual law? What's the accepted law in 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 uh, in our times? And also, a few hundred years later, there were many other questions that Maimonides himself didn't discuss. And so there later on, there was a great rabbi. His name was Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo he was actually a Sephardic rabbi, and he was the one that wrote what we call Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law. Shulchan Aruch means a set table, a table that's set. This is the Jewish law. And he went and he codified Jewish law. He was primarily the laws for Sephardic Jews. Right at that time, right after that time, there was a great rabbi called Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, the Rama, and he was from the Ashkenazi scholars. He lived in Krakow, and he wrote little small glosses like notes on the Shulchan Aruch, the difference of opinions, where the Ashkenazi opinion was different than the Sephardic opinion. And that's basically what we have and what we go according to in Jewish law. We have the Shulchan Aruch, and we have the Rama's notes on it, and that's pretty much what's binding in today's day and age, the Shulchan Aruch. Now, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, he wrote a updated version, especially for Ashkenazi Jews, for the code of Jewish law, and that's pretty much it came a few hundred years later. And that also gave more reasonings because the Jewish law just said this is the law. He gave us, the reasonings behind it, and there's a lot more up to date Jewish, and therefore that's pretty much what it's a lot of it is based on the original code of Jewish law, but that's pretty much what we go according to. But pretty much the Shulchan Aruch is where the laws are binding. Okay. Now there's a lot more to discuss on that. And we can have a whole discussion on, Jewish history and laws. But let's move on from this conversation because what I want to do now is go back to Talmud for a moment, because there's a lot more that we didn't yet get to in the Talmud itself. And that is like this. Turn to page 227. You can also see it on the screen. The Talmud itself, you look at it, the page you're looking at is our discussion from last week. The top few lines of the page is the concluding part of the Mishnah. 228. I'm sorry, 228. Go to 228. Okay? 228. Okay? Page 228. So the top part of the page is the concluding part of the Mishnah. 3 lines in, you see in bold, big letters, Gimel Mem, Gemara. That's where the Gemara starts. Now, what is something that you see in the Gemara that looks quite interesting? If you'd see it, you'd be like, wait, what's going on? So that you wouldn't notice, but here it's something very simple. There's no question marks, there's no periods, there's no commas, there's no punctuations. There's 0 punctuations in the entire Gemara. Right? So the Gemara, you look at it, and it also, there's no vowels. Like, how do you read it? How do you know how to read it properly? Right? So where does the question begin? Where does the question start? Where does the question end? How do you know what's a question, what's an answer? You're reading it, the Gemara, and by the way, this is the page at least we have, tells us where the Gemara starts. But imagine, you're learning this from here, and you have pages and pages and pages of just Gemara. It's like, where does one subject start? Where does one subject end? When are you talking about Pesach? When did he start talking about Kiddush and this and that? Right? Just like pages. it's so confusing, right? So this was a big problem, and a lot of Jews didn't know what to do. Today, by the way, they have Gemaras that have periods, question marks, cheating, right? But the the original, and what personally what I did when I was in yeshiva for many years was to learn how to learn Gemara. You have to learn how to learn Gemara. What is a question? What is the answer? What is a period? What is a comma? What is a question mark? We would sit in class and we would learn. But I'm talking about when I was in third grade, when I was in fourth grade, when I was 9, 8, 10, 11, 12, and put in a period, put in a question mark. And over time, we figure out on our own, oh, this is a question mark. This is, but there's more to that. There's more to that. What is the question of the Gemara? Sometimes the Gemara is going to ask a question. This word means question. Well, what is the question? I don't even know what the question is. So many people weren't even sure what the question was. So therefore, came Rashi. Rashi wrote a monumental writing. And Rashi lived a little bit after about 800 years ago. He lived in France. And Rashi wrote the commentator on the Gemara. If you look on page 228, Rashi is always on the right side. So Rashi is the right side. You'll see there's bold letters and then unbold letters. The bold letters is the quotes from the Talmud, and the letters that aren't bold is Rashi's explanation of those words of Gemara. What Rashi is basically doing is Rashi is explaining to us what that means in the Gemara. Like, you're trying to understand, you're not sure what this means. Is this a question? Is this an answer? Or what is the question? Right? So then Rashi will quote those words from Gemara and say, this is the meaning of this question. Or it's a hard word. Nobody ever heard of that word. Rashi will explain this Aramaic word means this thing. So you'll be able to understand what the Gemara is saying. So Rashi is basically helping us navigate Gemara. Okay? So I'll give you an example. Okay? Let's see X number 7. Now, X number 7, by the way, if you look on page 229, this is the original print of Talmud. Try to read that one. On page 228, at least that is somewhat readable. Try to read the one on 229, right? That's quite a, right? Now, that is the conversation that we discussed last week. If you recall, at great length last week, lesson 5, we discussed about the employee who could have a complaint, but they can't ask for any money. And we explained that it was maybe it means that he either retracted from it a long time before, so he can just have a complaint, or like majority of what we were saying was that there was an intermediary, right? You hired someone to hire workers for you, and you're complaining on the hire person, right? Verse 4 or verse 3, right? So let's see text number 7, page 229. This is a translation of that part of the Gemara. Okay, so let's read it.
What is the case if them at 4, and he went and said to them at 3, what is the function of complaint he knew and accepted? If the employer said to him at 3, and he went and said to them at 4, what is the case if he told them, your wages are on me, he gives them from his own?
So you read that, and you're like, that is completely confusing, right? Peggy read that as one long paragraph. But that long paragraph, actually, you're missing commas, periods, question marks, right? So this is the Gemara. Try to read this, right, without having periods. And if we would have enough time, I would actually spend some time together putting in the commas, the parentheses, and the question marks in just this paragraph. But just from shortage of time, trying to keep finishing on time, we see that this paragraph itself, which we learned all together, and Peggy just read it, she couldn't even figure out where's, you read it as well in the paragraph. Really, you have to pause, you have to read a certain line as a question and a certain line as an answer, right? Different tunes. There's a question, there's an answer, right? So that's where Rashi came. Rashi, he gave us in his commentary. Rashi is abbreviation of his name, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. Okay, in those days they didn't have last names. His father's name was Yitzchak, so it's called Yitzchaki, Ben Yitzchak, and it's basically a guide. Okay.
And I see he's got punctuation marks in his. Is that in the Talmud on his side? There's punctuation marks. Is that in the?
No.
With punctuation.
There's no punctuation marks in Rashi.
I thought you said it's on the right.
Yeah, but there's no punctuation marks. If you see a punctuation, it just means it's the end of like that explanation. Then it's going to the next one. There's no actual commas, or even Rashi doesn't put in.
I see colon. Semicolon.
What?
Colons.
The colons are telling you that this is the end.
Okay, Rashi put those colons.
Because Rashi is telling this is the end
Okay.
to explaining those words. And now it's going to start a new one. Right? He only tells you, but he doesn't himself. Okay, but now that's not really. Oh, that's not. It's those periods are just starting. It's saying that this is the quote from the Gemara, and now is where Rashi's explanation starts. It's not telling. Okay, let's actually read one example of one Rashi. Okay, on Gemara. So it's page 230, text number 8. So the Gemara. This is going from last week's conversation. The Gemara begins the discussion with if you recall, the Mishnah said that if you had workers that backed out, you could only have a complaint. You can't ask for money, right? So the Gemara asks the question: Hey Chidabi, what are the circumstances? That's the question. The Gemara starts with. If you learn Gemara, you know that those words means a question. But the question on the Gemara is, what do you mean? What are the circumstances? In which case are we talking about the circumstances? Are we talking about in this case or in a different case? What's the case that we're talking about that we're trying to understand the circumstances? Are we talking about the first case of the Mishnah, the second case of the Mishnah? The Gemara didn't say which case we're talking about that we're trying to understand in what is the circumstances. So here comes Rashi. Rashi then will explain to us in which case the Gemara's question is on. So let's see, page 230.
They give them a right to complain, but nothing more.
So Rashi basically misunderstand. In what case are we referring to? We're referring to the case that gives them the right to complain, but they can't ask for money. Because the Mishnah gave us 2 cases. The Mishnah gave us a case where they can ask for money. They can't ask, right? So Rashi came to explain to us which case you're referring to. So that's a classic Rashi. And there's many other Rashis. But this is the idea of what Rashi tries to explain to us. Okay? For shortage of time, I don't want to delve into too long, but if you look back at page 228, if you look at the left-hand side, turn back to 228. Okay? This is called the Tosfos. Tosfos were started by Rashi's grandchildren, and it went on for hundreds of years until the burning of the Talmud. If you remember in our first lesson, who remembers? We started off our first class saying that the Talmud was burnt in France. That's basically when Tosfos ended, because they burnt the Talmuds and the rabbis weren't able to teach and study. But for hundreds of years, great rabbis delved into Gemara and Rashi, by the way. A lot of it was also discussing Rashi, and they asked questions on it. Like, Gemara says this over here, but the Gemara says something over there which could contradict this Gemara, and that will explain to you how both don't contradict. Or Rashi says this opinion, this is what the Gemara means. I say the Gemara means something different. And he brings Rashi's own grandchildren arguing him a lot. Actually, that's why we have the mezuzah is slanted. Or many people put on 2 pairs of tefillin because Rashi and his grandchildren Tosfos argued. One said mezuzah has to be straight, the other one said it has to be slanted. And they both brought proofs from different places. Whatever. Anyway, I don't want to get into it too long, but basically what Rashi with Tosfos and many other commentators like Tosfos, as we said in the back over here, there's many commentators, and these are just a few. There's many commentators, okay? They're basically, they are glosses explaining what the explanation of the Talmud is. So the Talmud, the Gemara is explaining the Mishnah. Rashi, Tosfos, and many others after that are trying to dissect and understand the Gemara. And our commentators they dissect only one of the commentators. Like there could be tens of commentators just dissecting only Rashi's, trying to fully understand Rashi's. And then there's commentators just trying to understand Tosfos. And then there's, as I explained, there's many other rabbis similar to Tosfos, right? The Rav or the Ritva, and so there could be the Achronim. They could want to only understand what was a Rashba trying to understand, and what's this. And sometimes you could sit in yeshiva for days or even weeks, and what are you learning? You're learning one Rashi, and you're learning what the commentator who explained the Rashi and the ones that argued on the Rashi explained, and how which one makes more, can understand which one better. And you could be talking about this for days. Many days. Our whole class was understanding one Rashi, one line. That was it. For 3 hours. We're learning everything about this, and sometimes we continue the next day. So that's the brilliance. I'll actually share an interesting story. I was sharing with my kids last night. Today was the yard site of a great rabbi who lived about 89 years ago. His name was the Rogatchover Gaon. A brilliant man. The Rebbe actually considered him his teacher. He had a nephew who wasn't so much into studying Torah, was in a university, and he lived by him. Apparently, there's a big university. He lived in a place in Latvia called Vinsk. Today it's Daugavpils. I actually was there for a Passover once. I met people who remember the Rogatchover as kids. So his nephew comes to him one day and he says, I have a math question to ask you. My professor asked us this question. He said, this is a challenging question that nobody knows. He looked at the question, and in moments he gave him the answer. The next day, the nephew comes to the professor, gives him the answer to the question, and the professor screams at him, you didn't know that. Who told it to you? He said, no, no, tell me the truth. And he says, my uncle. Anyway, long story short, he meets the uncle, and as they're talking, this great professor says to him, why are you wasting your time studying Talmud? If you would be a professor, you would be the greatest professor of all of our times. He had a brilliant mind. They said when he would walk across the room, he would study the whole Talmud. When he would answer a question, he would answer like this. You want to know the answer to your question? Look here on this page, then look in this book on this page, look in that book on this page, then look in this book on this page, and you would go like this 50, 60 different places, and then you get your answer. He knew all those places, So the Rogatchover answered him. He said, he was learning Talmud. There was a page open in front of him. He said, look at these 3 lines of a Tosfos. He said, in these 3 lines, there's more brilliance than you'll ever learn your entire life. That's the beauty of our Torah. There's so much depth to it. They say Einstein and him met. They had similar minds, and they spoke, and whatever. It's recorded with their conversations. But the Rebbe actually used to write to him, and he would write back to the Rebbe. The Rebbe was a youngster; he was in his 20s, but he wrote back to the Rebbe great titles, and the Rebbe basically considered him to be his teacher. They say the Rogatchover was living in the times of the Talmud or the Mishnah. He would be one of the rabbis, part of the Mishnah. He had such a mind. Anyway, but the point is that there's so many other commentators explaining and going through it. Okay. Okay. Let's now move on. In our time, we'll move on to here. Okay? The Torah, as we just said, it's unlimited. There's so much to talk about. And there's so many modern day questions, right? What do you do in today's, modern day conversations? And even things that are unfortunately happening in the world, in 9/11 or in Gaza or other places, right? Things that come up where you never have imagined these things back in the days. So what's the answer in today's conversations, right? And in addition to that, there's in general things that people study, and the more you study, the more you learn, the more you have conversations, you have questions, and you want to understand. And this, the rabbis say, is actually important. That every single Jew has the capability to innovate in Torah. Of course, innovate in Torah. Of course, it has to be based on the principles of Torah. We can't say, oh, this doesn't make sense. Everything in the Talmud makes sense. Maybe you don't understand it, right? Or everything in Rashi makes sense. Maybe you don't understand it. We don't argue on them. We don't say it doesn't. We just try to understand it, right? And if we disagree, it's only because we're going according to a different great rabbi, like Maimonides, who would argue on Rashi, which they could, right? But the point is that we have the capacity to also innovate, meaning to learn Torah and come to innovative ideas and understand. And there are so many of the books that I have here on my shelf that were written by modern day rabbis who innovated, understood the Torah, and from that they deduced ideas. Actually, when we were in yeshiva, every single week they had put out a full book of students that wrote innovative ideas based on ideas that we studied in Talmud or in Jewish law or in Hasidus or in all these different places of Torah. People would write innovative ideas, and that's text 11. Let's hear text 11. Michael, you want to read text 11, page 231? And you'll also read text 12. Hey, you have to unmute.
Text 11. Okay. Insights from Sinai. Midrash Vayikra Rabbah 22. The insights that a veteran student will in the future say in front of his teacher were all given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And then 232, Old and New. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Lekudei Shechot. Seeing that all the innovations in Torah must be built on the principles that Moses received from Mount Sinai, it emerges that, quote, all was given to Moses at Sinai, close quote. Nonetheless, when a veteran student toils with their mind to reveal a specific idea within the oral Torah, an idea that accords to the Torah's principles, it creates something truly original in Torah.
Okay. Michael, I'm sorry. For some reason, we couldn't hear you. But if you read along, the point is that everything needs to be based on something, but it's more in the Medrash that every single insight that anyone came up with was taught to Moses and Sinai. Meaning everything is in the Torah, everything was taught to Moses, but there's the capacity for people to innovate. And not only that, in page 233, text 12b, the Rebbe says it's actually an obligation that every single Jew to innovate in Torah, to come up with new ideas in the Torah learning. So it's actually important that every single Jew comes up with ideas in the Torah, of course, based on what the Torah says, but innovative ideas. Okay? I just want to play the video now. Then we'll conclude.
Preserving the past.
That's my old yeshiva.
The Torah's endless guidelines allow for endless originality and growth. In recent times, the laboratory level created the Torah's provision and creativity for unprecedented innovation of its own. On the movement generalized days of the Virginia Structure das Mondes ich komme da nicht was ich da sagen, nicht die was soll also wir wollen bringen, was ich glaube, der nicht tätig vernehmen, die wollen die Elite strategisch. Io da te die prova da te, die Takte da te, die Menschen nach dem als Videos Millionen und nach Videos Millionen bekommen, in der Abend die Frage, der Insel und der Sachen sagen. Wir haben das alles sagen, dass wir eine Chance zu die Dinge. Ich habe die Teams in der Welt. Das ist the story. Every age, stage of knowledge to think of this better knowledge insight within all the classic works of the Jewish tradition. I mean, this lies this knowledge. I got everything was hesitatingly using the record at all. This is what he thought was the original charge to the actually brought the commentary on the drawer with his favorite juror. The entry was then read from himself. Which quickly suppressed and felt that was something, for the big leaders. One of the members of the editorial board that put all of the calculations to the side for their philosophy with this provided. The questions that first one published because it's the first philosophy of the living and then it's the other bottom, the note, the editor. This came, the question has been done with extensively by the class commentaries from Hussey. The question the next day, it came to that point of the blaming clear clinical self. It said the question was first passing. Like speaking like even though there is a trust, it's difficult. In light of the fact that the person who's asked also a similar question from the beginning of the means that we therefore need to find a singular answer that can resolve the question both from the beginning of Midor and also present just the full explanation as to both rations. Again, the first person that I looked for was listing a lot big stuff of space that that's on and on for the family kid. Every Jew is encouraged to drink from the divine well springs of Torah of his good. And every Jew is going to become a fountain of fresh ideas.
Okay, so just to conclude, in the beginning of the course, we spoke about, if you call the French burning of the Talmud. And we asked the simple question, why did they burn it? Why was it so important to burn the Talmud? They went and they literally found every copy of Talmud in the entire France and they made huge burnings. Why was it so important? I think now we understand a little bit of why it was so important. Because there's no book like Talmud. In all of Judaism and in the whole world, there's nothing like the Talmud. It's a conversation that just doesn't exist in any other place. And that's why it's so important. It's so important to the Jewish people throughout all the generations. the importance of studying Talmud, and there's ways. There used to be actually was called, and they still have until today. Let's actually see text 13. Brian, do you want to read text 13? We might not be able to hear. Let's just we'll include him. William from Mississippi.
Yeah, hang on, I just had to unmute my mic.
Here. Go.
If a mitzvah is performed by several people jointly, each participant is rewarded as if they performed the entire mitzvah alone. For this reason, the entire Jewish people have embraced the practice of forming Kevrot Shas, Talmud study clubs, for the sake of dividing the study of the entire Talmud between many individuals.
So many Jews, Jewish communities, what they did was they would split the study of the whole Talmud amongst their community. And if you do that, and every year you finish the whole Talmud, every community is like one group, and it's as if the whole community finished the whole Talmud. And then every year you take a different Talmud tractate. And this is a custom that goes on until today. That many people, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to learn the whole Talmud, I'll learn one tractate this year. Or I'll learn one section of one tractate this year. I could do that, you know? Or another example was, we spoke about this when we spoke about Haggadah, the Haggadah, it was called the book of Ein Yaakov. The Ein Yaakov was a book that was published a few years ago, and that basically takes all the stories and all the laws of the Talmud into one book. Makes it more interesting, more easier read. And if you remember in the third lesson, we spoke about the Haggadah. We said how the Haggadah Gemara, the Medrash Gemara, has so much depth to it. So there's and treasures hidden in it. So it's actually very special if you want to learn that. And then there's also what's called a daf, page 337. A daf means a page. It actually means a double-sided page in the terminology of Gemara. So a daf, which is a double-sided page, there are those that study one daf a day, which is two sides a day. A daf yomi, if you're familiar, it's a very famous thing, and they'll finish the whole Talmud in 7.5 years. They just finished it. They rented out a place that holds 100,000 people. It was packed, you know, in New York. It was amazing, and that's something special. Also, you know, there's many classes on daf yomi today that you can learn, or as we said earlier, similar to that, which is learning the law of the day, the Rambam yomi. You know, these are just things that you could take practical from this lesson, that you could do something. You can maybe learn even the Rambam, the daily Rambam, you know, one law a day, or one chapter a day of Rambam. Like this, you'll familiarize yourself with so much. And you might say to yourself, who am I to be able to learn this? I can't learn this. This is maybe for some great rabbis, you know, maybe Rabbi David can do it. But me, that's not at all possible. But the truth is, we learned about Rabbi Akiva, great sage, a few weeks ago. Rabbi Akiva was incredible. Rabbi Akiva himself did not even know Hebrew until he was 40 years old. He was 40 years old. He went with a young child to learn at age 40. And then what happened was he saw a rock that was dented in. He said, how could a rock get a dent? And he saw a drip of water dripping down. Slowly, he said, oh, if a drop of water, one at a time, to make a dent into a rock, the Torah, which is like water compared to water, because water goes from high to down to below, the Torah can also make a dent in my life. And I'll learn. And he became the greatest sage of all times. So much so that actually Moses said, like, who came up with that? They said it's Rabbi Akiva. But the point is, we all have the capacity. We all have the capability. We all could do this. We all could be like Rabbi Akiva. It takes will. It takes the ability to start somewhere. You got to do something. And if you start something, you'll get it done. And 1 second. And with that, we officially conclude this incredible course, the study of the Talmud and understanding the Talmud. Really been honor and a pleasure to teach this course. And I look forward, God willing, I would love to start a Talmud class. And if you're interested in joining a once a week a Talmud class, please let me know. We'll try to start something interesting and something that is attainable, and we'll learn it together. I'll probably start after Pesach, maybe before, but maybe right after Pesach. That's the plan.
English or Hebrew?
It will be studying from an actual Talmud, but we'll learn it in English. Like we'll read it inside in the Aramaic and the English and in the Hebrew, and we will translate it, and we'll probably have an art scroll or a Koran. We'll be able to learn it together, but we'll learn it together, and we'll appreciate it. What I want to just do for one moment, if you just give me one more moment, is to show the preview to next course. The next course will start right after Passover. It's an incredible course, and I think you'll really appreciate it. So let me just show a quick video on it, and then we'll officially click.
Thank you.
Okay. This